Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Emily, for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. I'm excited to share my exhibition, What Remains, What Renews, with you all. Just kind of going to get into kind of what I was thinking about with the development of this body of work, go into a little bit of that background that Emily already kind of shared with you. So I'm going to revisit some of that, and then I'll kind of get into more of the specifics as we go through. But with this exhibition, and with a lot of my artwork, I'm thinking a lot about the process of making. That's a really strong emphasis in my practice. I'm really drawn to incredibly repetitive, borderline obsessive is a word that's been used to describe a lot of those processes, but for me, I find it incredibly meditative, and so that's something that I'm really drawn to in my practice. With this body of work, I was thinking a lot about response. I've gone through kind of a lot of professional life changes over the last few years after finishing school, and I've been fortunate enough to kind of continue to create and exhibit work through all of that time, and I've recognized that there's not only really a response in my art making practice to my day-to-day surroundings, but also to myself within the process of creating a lot of that work. So that's something where I pull a lot of inspiration from in this body of work specifically. Another thing that you may notice as you look around the room is I have a strong interest in material exploration as well. I pull a lot of inspiration from our built and kind of constructed environment. And so I incorporate a lot of materials such as cast concrete, been using a lot of the artificial turf recently. Stained epoxy is an incredibly, I continue to go back to that material a lot. And so those are all being pulled from that interest in kind of construction and our constructed environment. And then finally, the last thing that I'm thinking a lot about with this exhibition is color. I tend to think about color in my artwork as a human element. In the past, I've worked with a lot of found objects, and color has really been kind of my hand or the human incorporation into that process or that final piece. And as you can see in this space, there's a lot of color. And I think I'm kind of viewing this exhibition in this body of work as kind of my experience of that life in transition, and I'll kind of get into what that looks like and what I mean by that with some of the more specific pieces as we get into it. So to kind of revisit some of the stuff that Emily had mentioned, I'm originally from Gretna, Nebraska, which is a suburb between Omaha and Lincoln. I got my BFA at the University of South Dakota. I earned that in art education with an emphasis in ceramics, and played soccer while I was there. And then I went on to earn my MFA in ceramics from K-State, which is also where I met my husband, who's hiding outside the door. And he helped me install the show and everything like that. So that's been very helpful. After getting my MFA in ceramics, I stuck around at K-State for a year and ran the 2D design program there. And I'll kind of revisit how that incorporated into my practice. And then last year, I was running the ceramic studios at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And currently, I've kind of stepped out of academics, and I'm working as a studio assistant for a sculptor in Omaha, Nebraska. So got to move back to Omaha after about 10 years, and that's been a really fun and exciting experience. So one thing that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk is I am thinking a lot about response. One thing that I've noticed and observed about myself in my practice is I pull a lot of inspiration of the processes and ideas and materials that I'm exploring by how I'm spending my day to day. So what that looked like when I was teaching 2D design at K-State, that was very much a digital media focused curriculum. I was teaching a lot of Illustrator, Photoshop, InDesign, things of that nature. And that is not my natural kind of creative practice, but I found ways that it was kind of starting to naturally find its way into my artwork, such as I was laser etching into the surface of clay, laser cutting into different materials like Tyvek, and then I also experimented with some clay 3D printing and things like that around that time. So when I moved to UNO and Emily invited me to come out and do this exhibition, I was starting to work in a ceramic studio again. And that got me, at that time, I just was in that studio all the time, working with people making things in clay, and I started kind of revisiting the hand-built ceramic objects again. And so that kind of brings me to the first two pieces I'm going to talk about today. It's this one here in the center and one in the back for you, right of the gallery. These I lovingly refer to as blobjects or blobs. So I will kind of get into that, but that's probably how I'll refer to them throughout this talk. But with these objects, these were the first forms I created when I was starting to develop the body of work for this show. In the past, when I was conducting the work for that international exhibition that Emily mentioned earlier, I did this series of tiles, which were all the same format. They were nice and flat, and I was really interested in exploring surface alteration. I pulled a lot of inspiration from painting, printmaking, drawing, things of that nature. I was pulling a lot of inspiration from that, and so I wanted to do that on a nice flat surface as kind of a reference to that inspiration. And so one thing that I also have been thinking about is the word surface decoration versus alteration or things like that. In ceramics, the word decoration is very normal and it's very widely accepted. But I work, like I said, I work in a sculpture studio, and I used the word decoration a few weeks ago, and I think I saw him kind of shiver a little bit when I said that, because that word is kind of icky for sculptors and painters and other processes. So that's something I'm trying to kind of think about and work through. But I'm very drawn to that surface decoration or alteration. And so with these blobs, I wanted to try to bring form into that idea. I had worked through a lot of surface ideas, and I wanted to revisit the form a little bit more. So when I was creating these blobs, I didn't really have a plan. I didn't have a plan for the final product or the final form of what it was going to be. I wanted to approach the construction incredibly intuitively. And so what that process looked like is I just rolled out a flat slab of clay, which is just a flat, even thickness piece of clay that I cut an organic shape from, and then I began to lift and kind of alter the base of these forms, where I would then build the walls from that. So that was kind of the consistent approach to the construction, and then I was just responding to whatever kind of came from that process. And so, and when I build these walls, I build them using the coil building technique, which is a hand building technique. And what that is you just roll out essentially logs of clay that you stack on top of one another and join together and smooth out and refine. So it's kind of a smaller, thinner process of building. It takes a little bit more time to build up those walls, and because of that, I'm not able to necessarily construct one of these forms in a single day or a single sitting. And so that provided a unique opportunity for me to respond to myself when I would come back to the construction of these vessels. So I'd have to walk away for whatever that reason may be. And when I would maybe have a plan of where I thought the piece was going to go when I came back, and a lot of the time that is not what happened. I would come back and something would change, and I really liked that kind of responsive observation that I was able to make during the construction. While building these, another thing I was thinking about was I wanted to leave negative space. I didn't close off any of these forms because I wanted to leave the potential conversation for the interior and exterior spaces of these vessels. So with this one here, this one's titled Specific Fields. I altered the surface of the exterior form, creating impressions into the clay, and then I did some dotting of glaze and added some sand to that glaze. So if you were to run your hand over it, it's not particularly smooth, you can kind of see that, but the conversation between the interior and exterior is very subtle. It's very low contrast when you look at that comparison. The inside is very smooth, but it's the same color as the exterior. So there's just some very subtle differences with this piece here, whereas the piece in the back, titled Accumulation, that's a little bit more high contrast. That conversation between the interior and exterior is a little bit more in your face, I would say. It's got a very smooth kind of matte orange interior, and the outside is incredibly textured. It's got kind of a high relief with the addition of the cast concrete and stained epoxy kind of oozing all over the surface of that one there. One thing I was struggling with, however, when I was making these is I get really inspired to create all different variations of these surfaces, and I can't create the forms fast enough. That was a problem I was kind of running into, and that's what inspired the wall hanging forms that you can see on either side of the gallery. I wanted something that I could, I wanted a single format, so something that would kind of unify them, but I could go crazy with the surface. I could alter their surface, pull inspiration from the one idea and move on to the next, and I could crank those out a lot faster and work through those ideas a lot quicker. That's kind of a reference to that tile idea that I had talked about in the past. I like that singular format, and I consider these what we call kind of in the ceramics world a multiple. So they're variations of the same thing, and I actually titled these pieces iterations, so they're kind of iterations of similar ideas. And where I get my inspiration to create these types of multiples really goes back to my undergraduate degree. My undergraduate professor was an old school potter, so everyone around me was making pots. They were making cups and mugs and bowls, and they would make hundreds of them, and then they would just create very subtle differences to the surface of those forms, but they were very simple variations. And that mode of production is something that I find very soothing in my practice, and that's why I consistently go back to that kind of multiples or single modality or format. When I'm working on these pieces, I also wanted to kind of continue to build on that idea of the interior and exterior. And so I pierced into a good number of them. I think 12 of the 18 of them have holes, where I was able to play with materials kind of coming out towards the viewer or moving in towards the wall. And I could play with that with ceramic glazes as well as some kind of mixed media additions such as the cast concrete, stained epoxy, turf, things like that. So kind of moving forward, I'm gonna start talking about these two pieces in the back. Those two pieces and this larger blob up here up front are some of the newer ideas that I've been working with, and I'm going to kind of continue to develop moving forward. These pieces were really inspired by, I was walking one day a few months ago, I was walking down the street to a protest, and there was this in construction bridge. Not a lot of construction done, but there's going to be a bridge going over the street I was walking on. And from a distance, I could just see this tall column. It was just a tall vertical shape, and I was really intrigued by what it was. From a distance, it was really small. There was nothing else going on around it, but it was this really large open column that I thought was really interesting. And as I approached it, I could see that it was this interior structure of a column that was going to support this bridge once it's constructed. And it's a really satisfying grid of rebar, a lot of nice negative space moving through it. And I was just really intrigued by it as an object itself. And I, in the past, have made a lot of vases that have a very similar format to that, very tall and skinny, just like the piece that you can see there. And I wanted to kind of just revisit that shape. And I was inspired by that column, and I just wanted to kind of create my own interpretation of it, so to say. And so with that piece there, I was playing with negative space by piercing the holes, playing with gravity and kind of release of control. I like to have a little bit of control in my surface and the processes that I'm using. And so letting the glaze kind of do what it's gonna do was really a fun kind of release with this, but then adding in the structure of that kind of wire mesh in the center to really kind of separate them and support it. Maybe give an illusion to an interior structure, kind of similar to that column that I was looking at. Kind of thinking of that same piece, I created the piece in the very back corner there. It's a very small version of these blobs that I was creating. And I was thinking a lot about scale. As I was very far away, I could not tell what was going on with that column, and it was in this wide, expansive field. And that really inspired that piece there as well. I wanted to play with commonplace construction materials, such as a cinder block, something that is life-size, but only a single unit of that is not super functional in construction. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to have this tiny blob that would rest within that cinder block, and how kind of these pieces can start to interact with our common construction materials. And then I wanted to play with the turf as a field that kind of functions similar to a frame with a painting or a drawing. It kind of gives it its own space. I wanted to play with that on that pedestal as well and give it its own space to kind of work within. Really makes it feel smaller to me for some reason, so I thought that that was really interesting. And that brings me up to this piece up front. This piece is titled Renew. Kind of helped inspire the title of this exhibition. This large ceramic blob was the last piece that I made when I was teaching at UNO and working in that studio. Again, thinking about scale, just like I was talking about with the small scale piece back there, wanted to go a little bit larger. Wanted to push it a little bit. I had access to a very large kiln, so I thought that I would just make a piece that would fill that kiln, and I wanted to try to push myself and go for that. And I glazed it up, put it in the kiln, opened it, and it had collapsed. And that is a very unfortunate reality of what ceramics is. It's something that you get very used to when you work with that material. And instead of throwing it away, I decided that I wanted to hold on to it. I saw the vision. I thought that there was something that I could kind of rework and reconstruct with it. I just didn't know what that was at the time. And so I took it and I moved it into my garage studio, which is very small. It's a single car garage. So if you think that this piece looks relatively large in here, it looks ginormous in that tiny studio space. And it was literally in pieces. So it was a little bit, I had to sit with it for a few months, and I was working on everything else, and I would just have to live with it for a while. And I wasn't really discouraged or disappointed. I just was kind of waiting for the inspiration to strike. And so where this final product came from is I started working in this sculpture studio, and our first kind of big project that we had once I started working was we were working on a big mural. And as part of the mural, since he's a sculptor, he created these figures that incorporated fiberglass and resin as part of the process of construction. And I never worked with fiberglass, and I was really intrigued by that. I have, however, worked with resin, and I was not super satisfied with it when I worked with it many years ago. It was clear. I was just casting with it. It was a really delicate process, and I should be a little bit more delicate, but I'm not a super delicate worker. I'm a little klutzy, and so I had some struggles with resin, but I was really inspired to kind of revisit that idea now that I'm staining things and I can play with the viscosity of it. And so what I ended up doing is I created a wire reconstruction of the top half of this piece. And then I coated that in fiberglass with resin, and then I just thickened up the resin and essentially frosted the top of it with resin. I painted it on with a palette knife, which is actually very much how I approach oil painting. Whenever I've done oil painting in the past, I've been told I paint like a sculptor, not super delicate, like a lot of texture. So it kind of reminded me of all of that process. But I left the insides that you can kind of see that internal structure, again, kind of thinking of that column that I had seen recently. And I liked the thin drips of resin kind of going down and moving up. That was the thickness that I was using when I was applying the fiberglass, and then I was able to thicken it up and kind of control it a little bit more with that top surface. So I kind of wanted to incorporate the evidence of all of those steps in the final product of that piece there. So I'm very happy with how that one turned out in the end, but it was just a process to kind of get there. And then finally, the last piece I want to talk about is this piece here. It's titled Evidence. All of these individual squares are pieces of cardboard with stained epoxy on their surface. So what I do when I'm using epoxy, I use that to connect most of the materials that I add to my surfaces. It's what's all over that concrete, under that concrete dollops on that piece back there. And I just mix them up on scraps of cardboard that I have in my studio. And about 3 years ago, I decided to start saving them. I thought they were kind of interesting. I didn't really have a plan for it yet, but this is about 3 years worth of saved epoxy. So I have pieces that from when I was in graduate school in Manhattan, Kansas. I did a residency in Puerto Vallarta, getting ready for that exhibition down there. So some of these are from that. And then the rest of them are from my time in Omaha making the body of work for this show. And I was excited to finally put together an arrangement. What I like about this piece is, thinking about multiples, I can kind of change this arrangement. I can continue to grow. I could have installed it a million different ways. And so I think it's really fun to have a piece that is a little bit more site specific and can kind of change over time. And I just kind of view it as a visual journal of that kind of art making process that I've been working on for the last few years. And I'm really excited with the final product of that and to finally get a space to be able to explore it. But that's all I've got. Are there any questions about anything I was talking about, any of the work, materials, processes? I'm open to talking about anything.
So what's working with fiberglass like? What's the material like? I've never worked with that before.
I found it a little bit frustrating. It was cool. It's just very stringy, and so you just have to paint on a lot of the resin, and then you have to just really get it stuck on there. Once it sticks to itself, it is very strong. I could probably sit on this and it would not go anywhere, but it is a pretty cool process. I thought I would be able to do it cleaner, was my first initial thought, but the thinness of that resin, I just needed to thicken it up a little bit, and yeah.
So what's the difference between using epoxy and resin? Are they essentially the same?
Very similar. Very similar. What I liked about the resin is, you know what it is. It's very clear, it's very thin and runny. The resin that I started using, they had this, what was it called? It was a variation of silica that you could add to it and you could thicken it up. And so I could essentially get it as thick as the stained epoxy that I use. And I almost like it more. Don't tell the stained epoxy that I've been using for 3 years, but I think I liked it a little bit more because I could thin it out a little bit and have it run a little bit more. I had a little bit more control with it. Yeah.
Is that what the dripping is on that cylinder? I was wondering what the dripping are. Is that the resin you're using or to create?
Yeah, so that's actually glaze. So that was part of the ceramic process. So I essentially just dried the glaze out enough where I could roll it into coils, and then I just kind of let it do what it was going to do. So it just kind of melted in the kiln, and the flat lines are just where it landed on the shelf. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. I love those are beautiful reflections.
Oh, thank you.
Your creative process.
Thank you. Yeah.
I was drawn to how you talked about your practice and your process and your iterative little side jobs there.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, you're okay. Yeah, it's great.
But it gets me thinking a lot about other creative practices.
Yes.
I have a writing practice.
Oh, wonderful.
But I just love this idea of bringing the iterations to their own embodiment and completion. And when I look at what you've done, I keep greenhouse file, and it's a disaster. It's just side jobs that I get off on as I'm creating and building things. But I never thought to bring those forward. Sometimes they show up somewhere later. But mostly it's just a trash heap. So I have a question for you.
Okay.
There have to be iterations missing.
Yes.
Or can you talk a little bit about what's missing in those that whole part of the iterations that are missing? I just love what you've done here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I had a piece. I would say one that jumps out into my mind is it's a pink blob, and it was the very first one that I made. And the very first one was inspired by a project that I developed for a class, and it was simply for my intro ceramic students, and we were just figuring out how to hand build with clay. And I created this small piece. It was supposed to be smaller, and it kind of got away from me and got a lot larger, and it developed into this kind of different thing that turned into this series of work that you can see here. And with that one, turf, with my background playing soccer, the turf as a material has been something that's very interesting to me for a very long time. I've literally bled all over. It's like all of those experiences, I've interacted with that material quite a bit, and I avoided it for a very long time because I wanted to remove myself from it. I think I stopped playing in 2019. And so now about, 6 years later, I feel like I can finally start to bring that in, and I was drawn to it as a material for its formal properties, and so that was where I started to incorporate that as a material, was with that piece. And I played with it kind of underneath it, I attached it in different places, and I ended up coating the entire interior with the turf. That was how I ended up finishing that piece. And I think that that one is an interesting one to leave out. I ended up deciding, I've exhibited it in some other places, and I wanted to kind of showcase some other work, but that's an interesting question about the things that are missing. And I think that that's one that really jumps out in my head as, I think, one that's kind of important to the development of these, but isn't necessarily here. Yeah. Yes.
So I want to just kind of springboard over that and talk about the same pieces. And now, right now, it seems like they're all part of a whole.
Yes.
They're all part of a team.
Yeah.
If you will. Now, do they have a future of branching out on their own individually? And that's what I'm kind of curious about.
Yeah. So the intention is that they can read as individual. I think that they all have very strong personalities as individual pieces, and the intention of them being that single format is so that they can read as a team. I do have ideas for pieces where maybe they won't. Maybe it'll be an installation of 7 to 10 of them where the compositions read together and they probably need to stay together. But I think that all of these ones that are in here, I view them as individual pieces that can read well together. I actually, when I was installing this show, I went back and forth on so many of them because some of them do stand out so much. I'm like, does it need to be a part of this? Do they need to, I ended up putting all of the ones in that I was kind of planning to, but some of their personalities are so strong that it's almost harder for me to have them read as a team than as the individuals sometimes. Good question.
I have more of a comment, I guess, than a reflection, but I like the conversation about process that you've been having, because I think many artists, we try to hide the process,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We're like, this is the object. Don't look at the 500 pages of crap that I wrote
Mhm.
before I got to the object, right?
Yeah.
But in the south of Spain, at one of these big interior architectural pieces, they had different craftsmen building different columns.
Oh, cool.
And
Yeah.
so they had them put their marking on the bottom of each column that they built, and then
Yeah.
they gathered all of that in one part of like the reflective part of the space, kind of like you did here, where you could actually see the hand of the person.
Cool. Yeah.
Right, as the evidence of the whole piece.
Yeah.
So I like this idea of actually presenting the working object
Thank you. Yeah.
as part of it, because this is a mistake. Essentially, what you're saying is like this began as a failure.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And then became something else. Has that always been part of your process? Has that always been part of like what you're trying to achieve to show process, I guess?
It's the thing that's the most natural for me. It's the thing I would also say it's the thing that's the most genuine. I think a lot of it goes back to my time in my educational background. My undergraduate professor had an approach where we were really focused on just figuring out how to make things with clay, and I learned a lot about process, and it was something that worked well for me. The conversation, the narratives behind, the pieces was almost my weak point. And I think a lot of undergraduate students can kind of relate to that in a lot of ways. And I went to graduate school and I was starting to develop a narrative behind what I was doing and having to really reflect on what I was doing. And it was a little painful at times because I was forcing things. I was trying to talk about things that weren't real for me and they weren't necessarily there. And once I realized that I can talk about the thing I should just focus on the thing that's the most genuine, which is just the love of making and kind of reflecting on why when that started to come up for me. And in terms of kind of conceptual conversation and narrative with that, that's when I started to incorporate materials that could start to inform that conversation. So labor and I don't have any experience in construction, but figuring out how to use construction and labor materials to talk about that has been something that I have found very beneficial for not only my artwork, because I'm very interested in exploring different materials, but also the conversation behind it as well and conveying that. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I've noticed on a couple of pieces you have a gold glaze. Is there any reason you didn't use more of it? Or what is the reason you used it sparingly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's gold luster, which is I do have a luster on the piece that it's purple and green kind of in the middle there. That is a gold luster, which is a ceramic material of the genuine metal that gets applied and then fired on. It's very expensive. It's a very expensive material to incorporate, unfortunately. And I try to incorporate it very sparingly because it can be very overpowering. And so with that one, I thought it would be kind of fun to cover it up with the concrete, which is less expensive and less precious and more common. And so that was kind of my intention with that piece. But then over here, where you're seeing the gold, that's actually gold leaf. I was starting to play with that. I've never really played with it before. And the reason I only used it on these pieces, it felt right with the earthenware clay. So these are a different clay body than these over here. These are a lower temperature. They have just different material properties. And so I was playing with this material and I wanted to leave it present. You can see I added a bunch of color to all of this stuff over here and I kept these a little bit more natural on their surface. And I thought that the gold was just, it needed another element. And I felt like that was something that was working really nicely with that over there. And then when I started working on these ones over here, because I did kind of chronologically finish those first and then worked on these, it just didn't quite feel as right. There was enough color, there was enough stuff going on their surface that I thought that the gold leaf may take away from some of it. And so that's kind of how I decided to go about it there. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the body. And I'm thinking about your practice and your process and the way you talk about the materials that you encounter in the concrete immediacy of your everyday life, right? Mm-hmm. And you talked a little bit about the turf and your relationship to the turf as a body playing soccer, right?
Yes, yeah.
So how does the body figure into your work and the things that you do? I just feel body imagery here.
Yeah.
I feel embodiment.
Yeah.
I know that's part of the medium that you're working in, but is there could you articulate some kind of presence of that in your work?
It's a really good question. It's something I've also been thinking about with this body of work a lot, especially with these more biomorphic forms. They're more organic. I historically have used a lot of very rigid, very sharp line, things that are a little more geometric. And so things in this space are a little bit more organic compared to what I have been using. And so I'm kind of still reflecting on that. I was talking actually with Shannon yesterday in here, we were talking about these. An observation I made once I got all the work in the space is that everything with the exception of that piece back there is horizontal. It is all shorter and wider. And I'm still kind of trying to understand why that is the format. My husband actually, when I was working on these blobs and finishing them up, he's like, you need to make one that's taller. And it just made me uncomfortable, the idea of it. And I don't actually necessarily know what that is yet. I'm still kind of reflecting on it. But yeah, Shannon had mentioned that these remind her of babies, newborn babies that are incredibly fragile and soft in a lot of ways. And I could see that, especially with the scale. They're like the scale of a child. And so those are kind of things. I think for me, where the body comes in is in that process. Physically making the work, it's an entire movement. It's quite physical in just the act of just rolling out the slab to get the piece started. Especially if you don't have all of the equipment and things like that. And so I think a lot of it is just through that act and the physical. I choose to do processes that are a little bit taxing and a little bit time consuming and kind of physically demanding. And I think that for me is where it comes in, at least from what I can tell right now. Yeah. Good questions, yeah. Yeah, 3D printing is one. So I did some clay 3D printing, which They have these 3D printers where you can print in clay, and there are a lot of artists that do really great things with it. It was not my natural the whole prep of it was it's very time consuming. I wanted to spend my time actually, making it. But 3D printing is something that I'm kind of curious about. He has 3D printers that I have access to. I just need to. Yeah, I like those technologies. When I did my thesis exhibition, I was starting to incorporate the laser etching. But I was actually etching scans of my handmade drawings that I was doing. And so that was kind of interesting because it was more of a reflective process. So I had drawn this image physically, but then was using the machine to kind of watch it be applied. And so I think that there is the potential. I'm not opposed to it, but that's something that I am interested in. I just don't know what that is yet.
Are you specifically just with ceramics and clay, or have you kind of dabbled into plaster or anything? Speaking of construction.
Yeah.
Texture art using plaster.
Yeah, I haven't used a lot of it beyond making molds in ceramics. So that is still that ceramic process. I did all of my education with ceramics as a background, which is great. There's a lot to know about clay as a material, but I like to think of myself as more of a mixed media artist. And so while this is the first exhibition I've had since my BFA show in undergrad where it was just ceramics heavy. And I just kind of view it as the vehicle for the conversation, but I'm really interested in those other materials. And so I haven't played with plaster per se specifically, but I am interested in kind of exploring some of those other materials beyond just surface application as more of the forms for alteration or for the conversation, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I've been curious about plaster recently too. But, I was wondering, do you ever try to kind of post maybe workshops and
Yeah.
community and everything? Or
Yeah.
already do that?
I don't have a lot of experience. So with this sculpture studio, it's very new. It's just the one artist. He has us and myself and my husband are studio assistants, and then there's one other person, and we're working with him and kind of working on getting a gallery set up, and then kind of potentially going to move our spaces into that space and start to continue, and maybe that will build into this idea of workshops and things like that later on. Yeah, so.
A little small garage studio.
Yes, yeah, I built a table for it, and that was my first time. So construction, I built a table, that was very exciting. And and kind of building off of that, thinking about these pieces in the back, where I'm thinking about environments for pieces, I would like to use more construction with the work that I'm already kind of developing and working on, and trying to find different ways of installing them. I had ideas for it with this exhibition. I just kind of ran out of time when I wanted it to work, and I don't think it would have looked probably as good as what it can look like maybe in a few months. But those are some things, working with wood and maybe some metal and stuff, are things I'm interested in moving forward. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I don't even know what time it is. 12:42.
Time for more.
Yeah, so I think we have time. Yes.
How do you make the indents in the?
Yeah. So when it's at the greenware stage, when it's wet clay, I just use these little ball tools that I found on Amazon, and I just make impressions, but I have a variety of sizes. So typically I start the trails with the largest shape, and then I kind of just work down to the smaller little heads of those, and I just kind of build them out intuitively from there. Yeah. Good question. Yes?
I noticed in that one at the bottom, there's pools of
Yeah.
rose.
Resin for that one. Yeah.
Is that purposeful or on accident?
It was purposeful in the sense that I wanted that thinnest resin. I wanted it to kind of move. So when I was building this, I coated the bottom of this piece as well in the resin and kind of painted that on, and that's where you see those kind of vertical drips coming up. And I wanted to kind of reference that on the interior, so I thought it would be kind of cool if there was resin on the very bottom and resin kind of within the base, and kind of have it the ceramic kind of sandwiched between that. Yeah. So that was kind of my thought with that one. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, you guys could, if you want to, have like the next 20 minutes or so
Cool.
to
I'll hang
chat.